everyone, and welcome to a new video. In today's video, I'm focusing on making a frilly apron and explaining how you can make one too. I whipped up my first apron using this pattern in a little over an hour, and the one shown in this tutorial took about 90 minutes. So it's a pretty easy and very fun project. And it can either be a practical garment for cooking or an accessory to pair with any costume that requires a frilly apron. The design and pattern for this piece are based on ones in a textbook from the early 1900s, which I will link down below. Because of that, this apron is most appropriate for early 20th century themed projects. But it looks really cute over mid-century dresses too, and I'm sure it could be altered for a variety of things. The pattern for this project is pretty easy. It's mostly made up of rectangles. Specifically, one 60-inch by 36-inch rectangle, three 30-inch by 5-inch rectangles, two 35-inch by 10-inch rectangles, two 3-inch by 42-inch rectangles, and a 7-inch by 8.5-inch by 8.5-inch trapezoid. Wikipedia describes trapezoids as a convex quadrilateral with at least one set of parallel sides, in case you were confused. Speaking of confused, I'll have all of these measurements on my blog so you don't have to make notes during this video. Finding fabric for this project should be pretty easy too. The design I originally based this on specified using a light, durable material, so I picked a medium weight cotton shirting for this piece. But you could use a heavier material or lighter one depending on how you want the apron to look and function. If you intend to use it while cooking, make sure you pick a washable fabric which will hold up against stain removing solutions. And you should pre-wash the fabric too. If it's mostly for show, then you could use a lighter cotton or even a pair of IKEA curtains that you had laying around. Since this is supposed to be historically themed, I would suggest a white or off-white fabric, as that was most common. My fabric is a cream tone, since I find that looks a little more worn in and authentic, even if it's less accurate. I'm also going to use a bit of lace for the front, but that is optional. Now on to the construction. Started by cutting out the skirt portion. I wanted my apron to be pretty long, so I cut my panels to be 36 inches long, which includes a 3-inch hem allowance. But you could cut yours to whatever length you prefer. And since my fabric was only 40 inches wide, I cut two panels for the skirt. One was the full width of the fabric, and the other was half the width. When sewn together, these create the 60-inch horizontal measurement that I wanted for this piece. Out of the remaining fabric, I cut the straps. These are 10 inches wide and 35 inches long. They will be folded in half later on and have a half-inch allowance on either side, so the finished straps are only 4 inches wide. But if you are a smaller human than me, or prefer a more delicate strap, then this can be made more narrow. The next rectangles are 5 inches by 30 inches, and you should cut 3 of them. These will make up the waistband and waist ties. And once again, they will be folded in half, so don't be too intimidated by the width. As far as length goes, I made mine 30 inches long, since that is slightly longer than the apron's finished waist measurement. You'll want yours to be proportional to your waist measurement too, so you may have to add or subtract from this measurement. Also, keep in mind what you're wearing this over. Since this is based on the boxy styles from the 19s, I made mine a little larger in the waist to pair well with this style. And here I'm cutting out the trapezoid. That word reminds me of Zoidberg, which makes me want to watch Futurama again, which is not even remotely related to this video. Anyway, this piece is 8.5 inches wide at the top and 7 inches wide at the bottom, and it is 8.5 inches tall. There are 1.5 inch seam allowances on each edge that are included in those measurements. This part is optional, but I'm also cutting two 3-inch by 40-inch strips, which will be used as ruffles on the shoulders of the apron. I know I said this part was optional, but I lied. Your apron definitely needs ruffles. I don't get political very often, but this channel is very pro-ruffles. I'm also pro-bunnies, and historical lady figurines, and shoes, and glitter, and glittery shoes that have bunnies on them. I clearly have a bright political future ahead of me. With everything cut out, construction begins, starting with the skirt. I'm pinning the panels together with the wrong sides facing each other. Then sewing them together with a 1/2 inch allowance. The seam allowance is trimmed down to 1/8 of an inch. And the seam is pressed open until smooth. Then the fabric is folded on the seam line so the right sides are facing each other, and it's ironed once again. I pinned across the fold to hold it in position, then stitched a 1/4 inch away from the fold to form a 1/4 inch French seam. Obviously you can skip this step if you're working with 60-inch wide fabric in the first place, since then the skirt can be cut as a single piece. However, you may have to do this more than once if you're using a very narrow fabric that requires more than 2 panels to get the 60-inch width. This was ironed once again. I don't always film it, but I do always iron my seams. And now the edges can be hemmed. To do this, I turned the vertical edges inward by 1/2 inch twice, using my iron to form a rolled 1/2 inch hem. I did this by eye, but you can use chalk or a washable marking pen to mark this if you aren't confident in your estimating skills. I sewed as close to the edge of the portion turned inward as I could to create an even line of stitching from the exterior. And more ironing, because if the vertical edges pucker or fan out, that can mess with the shape of the apron, but that has more to do with your thread tension than how thoroughly you iron. I'm also turning the bottom edge inward by 1/2 inch, and once again I'm doing this by eye. However, the next step is turning the hem inward by 2.5 inches, and I wasn't confident I could do that by eye. So I used a ruler and a marking pen to draw a line 5 inches away from the bottom edge of the apron. Then I brought the bottom edge of the apron up to that line and pinned it into position. The reason I went for such a wide hem is because that was most common up until the 60s and 70s. The wider hem weighs the bottom edge of the skirt down, which causes it to drape better over skirts and be less prone to blowing up. It also allows for alterations in the future if it is passed down to someone taller or if the hemline style changes. And in a pinch, material from a wide hem can be used to repair more visible parts of a piece if they become threadbare, damaged, or stained through frequent use. Hems were often sewn by hand, but for the sake of time I did this by machine, sewing as close to the folded edge as I could. I also used a very small stitch length since I've observed that is more common on historical garments. That was ironed, then set aside, so work on the bodice could begin. The literal center of the bodice is the trapezoid piece, and the first step in preparing this is turning the top edge inward by 1/2 inch, then inward by 1 inch to hide any raw edges. If you aren't using trims on this project, go ahead and stitch this hem into position. If you are using trims, then that step isn't necessary. Cut a piece of lace to be slightly longer than the width of the piece, then pin it so it begins around 1/2 inch away from the top edge of the trapezoid. I need a better name for that. I'm calling this the yoke now. The lace can be sewn onto the yoke by machine or by hand. However, if you do it by machine, I would suggest following the pattern of the lace instead of sewing it in a straight line. That will make the stitches less noticeable, and the stitching securing the lace also secures the hem. Now the edges can be folded inward by 1/2 inch and inward by 1/2 inch again, once again creating a rolled hem with no visible raw edges. I stitched this hem by machine as well, then set the yoke aside. It's time for the optional, but highly recommended ruffles. These are created from the 3-inch wide strips, and before being gathered, they must be hemmed. I'm doing a 1/4 inch rolled hem, and since this hem is so narrow, it isn't prone to puckering, so you can get away without using pins for this. Like the name 1/4 inch rolled hem suggests, this process consists of turning the bottom edge inward by 1/4 inch and stitching it down, then turning it inward by another 1/4 inch and stitching it down again. The gathering of these ruffles is a little tricky. Instead of just gathering the top edge, I start by gathering the sides to create a rounded finish. I'm also tapering the gathering from a 3/4 inch allowance at the ends to a 1/2 inch allowance at the center, so the ruffles are slightly wider at the top of the shoulder. And my gathering method for this is called shoving the fabric under the presser foot until it's the length I want it to be. However, gathering the material by hand will give you a nicer finish. You can also use a gathering foot if you have one, or any other preferred method. When the ruffles are finished, trim the top so there's an even 1/2 inch seam allowance, and use an iron to press them slightly so they are less wild. Now make a mark 9.5 inches away from the bottom edge of the strap pieces. Align the edges, and with the right sides facing each other, pin the ruffles from this point onward. They should end about 4 inches away from the other end of the strap. And when pinning, make sure the pins are more than an inch away from the raw edge since you don't want these to get in the way when sewing. Now fold the strip in half lengthwise and pin the long edges together. You want to form a tube with the ruffles on the interior. And repeat with both straps. Sew across the long edge using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now turn the tubes right side out. The raw edges should all be hidden on the inside. As a side note, you could use basting stitches to secure the ruffles instead of the pins. Then you'll have more control over the top edge placement and be less likely to prick yourself when turning the tubes the right way out. I top stitched about a 1/4 inch away from the edge. This prevents the ruffles from shifting around. Now the straps are pinned to the yoke. Make sure the bottom edges are even, then lap the straps over the yoke by a 1/2 inch. You can actually use the hemming stitches of the yoke from earlier as a guide if you want, and pin everything into position. Then top stitch the straps on. Once again, I'm stitching a 1/4 inch away from the edge, and I'm carrying the stitching across the entire edge of the straps. Now onto the waistband. This is made of 3 pieces, and step 1 is connecting them using 1/2 inch seams. The strips on either side will form the ties, where the center strip will be the actual waistband. You want to leave the center strip alone for now, but pin the 2 ends into tubes with the raw edges even and the right sides facing each other. I also decided to sew the ends into points, since that looks fancier, so I used a ruler to create guides for that. Now sew the tie portions with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now turn the ties the right way out. And iron the ties so the edges are nice and crisp. I also went ahead and turned the raw edges of the center strip inward by a 1/2 inch, forming this. Now you want to mark the center point at the center strip and the center of the yoke, and line those up. The yoke should extend 1.5 inches into the waistband and be squished between the 2 layers so raw edges are nice and hidden. Now make a mark 2.5 inches away from the edge of the yoke portion. This is where the other end of the strap will begin. If you want, you can crisscross the strap so the apron is less prone to shifting down, but I didn't do that. This end of the strap is pinned between the layers of the waistband as well, and the reason it's inserted so deeply is because the top stitching across the bottom edge of the waistband will offer extra security. But first, I'm securing the top edge of the waistband, and this stitching actually begins at the top edge of the ends of the ties and continues across the entire edge. This is definitely one of those projects where you need the visuals for it to all make sense, but hopefully the visuals are clear enough to make up for my crappy instructions. Now measure across the waistline from the end of one strap to the end of the other. For me, this measurement was about 28 inches. This is the measurement you should gather the skirt down to. And to prevent fraying, either serge or bind the top edge. Pin the skirt to the bottom edge of the waistband, aligning it with the ends of the straps. And this is sewn on using top stitching from the end of the bottom edge of the tie all the way to the other end of the tie. The apron is wearable at this point, but since I didn't crisscross the straps, it can fall down easily. So I sewed a hook and eye into the back of the straps about 8 inches up from the waist. This keeps it positioned nicely and is still easy for me to get on and off. You could use a button or a ribbon tie for the same purpose. And the reason I did this instead of crossing the straps is because I find that makes aprons impossible to get on and off without destroying my hairstyle. And since this is mostly paired with historical costumes, I put a lot of effort into my hair and would like it to stay intact. With the hook and eye whip stitched in place, the apron is finished. I really like how this turned out. It's definitely better than my first attempt that was featured in my cooking video. All the raw edges are nicely tucked away and the material is thicker, which makes it more practical as an actual apron. I hope this tutorial was helpful and that it will help you achieve any Ruffly apron dreams that you may have in life. Also, I have a video about the dress I made to go with this apron, which will be linked somewhere. And there are lots of other tutorials on my YouTube channel if you are interested in those. And if you'd like to see my original apron in action, I will link the video I wore it in the upper right hand corner as well as in the description box. But please, if you do watch it, don't comment that sharp knives are safer and that salmon comes from Nova Scotia. I know, okay? Let me live my life. And before I go, I just want to give a huge thank you to all of my Patreon supporters, and an especially big thank you to Jordan Carpenter, Mo Quintana, Heidi Nizer, Sharon Cyrus, Steffi S, Dot Cosplay, Tabitha Langston, Jennifer Pingleton, Ashley Jackson, and Rachel Bishop. I wouldn't be making videos without you guys, and I really appreciate the support even more than I could put into words. And now, for making it to the end, you get to see my very first apron, a relic from the early 21st century, based on what I could make in half an hour and turn into a maid costume because I'm good at Halloween. And that is the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching it. I really appreciate it. And if you enjoyed it, giving it a like and a comment really helps me out. And if you want to subscribe or check out my Instagram or Patreon, that's cool too. Thanks again for watching, and I shall talk to all of you very soon.